The river does not look dangerous at first. Seen from above, it coils through the plains in broad brown loops, carrying glimmering sheets of light beneath the heat of the sun. Reeds bend along its banks. Birds circle over marshes where fish gather in dark water. Villages cling to higher ground in clusters of mud, brick and timber. Even now, thousands of years later, parts of the old floodplain still appear strangely calm, almost unfinished, as if the land is waiting for something to return. But beneath those quiet fields lies an absence large enough to swallow a kingdom. Archaeologists first notice it in fragments. A wall emerging from river mud after an unusually dry season. Pottery scattered where no settlement is supposed to exist. Ancient tree roots preserved beneath layers of silt. Then come the buried foundations, entire districts hidden below farmland, canals leading nowhere, roads ending in dead marsh. The deeper researchers dig, the stranger the landscape becomes. Cities once stood here. Markets crowded these banks. Kings ruled from somewhere beneath the shifting earth. And then, somehow the river erased them. Not in a single night. Not in one dramatic wave remembered forever in surviving chronicles. The destruction appears slower, more confusing, and in some ways more frightening. A river can kill gradually. It can move a few hundred meters in one season, then another few hundred in the next. It can flood too early or too late. It can abandon the channels that sustain crops. It can turn fertile farmland into stagnant swamp. It can bury one city while leaving another untouched only a short distance away. Over decades, then generations, entire political systems begin to fail for reasons people living through them may never fully understand. What survives in the record suggests that this kingdom lived at the mercy of water long before it realized the danger. The old maps are unreliable because the river itself no longer follows the same path. Ancient channels now lie stranded beneath dry fields visible only from satellite imagery or subtle differences in soil color. Some vanished waterways appear as pale scars across desert terrain. Others remain hidden entirely until floods expose them again for a brief moment before the mud closes over them once more. In places, modern farmers unknowingly plant crops directly above drowned temples and collapsed warehouses. The landscape behaves like a memory that refuses to stay buried. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. For centuries, travelers crossing this region report odd discoveries after storms. Bricks appearing where no ruins are known, ancient coins carried up by floodwater, human bones emerging from collapsing banks. One medieval account describes fishermen dragging carved stones from the riverbed so large that several men together could barely move them. Local legends speak of bells heard beneath the water at night, or entire streets hidden under reeds and black mud. Most of these stories are impossible to verify. Some are almost certainly inventions added over generations. But legends tend to gather around places where something real once happened. And something happened here. The kingdom itself survives only in fragments of inscription and scattered references from neighbouring states. There is no complete historical account of its fall. No single surviving document says plainly that the river destroyed everything. Instead, the evidence arrives in pieces separated by centuries. A tax record abruptly ends. A royal building project is abandoned halfway through construction. Grain shipments disappear from trade archives. Settlements shrink. Cemeteries thin out. Then entire urban centres vanish from the written record altogether. At first, historians blamed war. That explanation appears reasonable. Ancient kingdoms collapse constantly through invasion, rebellion, dynastic conflict or economic breakdown. Human violence leaves familiar scars across history, but the deeper archaeologists examine the buried landscape, the less satisfying the military explanation becomes. There are surprisingly few signs of widespread burning in some major settlements. Defensive walls remain partially intact in places where one would expect deliberate destruction. Valuable goods are left behind in hurried layers of abandonment. Most importantly, the geography itself appears broken. The river moved. That simple fact changes everything. Modern rivers seem stable because human engineering forces them into predictable channels with levees, dams, embankments, dredging systems, and flood controls. Ancient rivers behaved differently. Many wandered across floodplains over centuries like living things searching for easier paths. Some shifted slowly enough for nearby populations to adapt. Others transformed with shocking speed after earthquakes, unusual monsoon cycles, glacier melt, or repeated floods weakened the land. The river at the center of this mystery may have done all of those things at once. Sediment cores extracted from deep beneath the plain reveal alternating layers of fertile soil and catastrophic flood deposits. In some areas, thick blankets of coarse sand appear where calm agricultural land once existed, suggesting violent surges of water crossing populated terrain. Elsewhere, stagnant wetland sediments replace evidence of active irrigation. Pollen trapped in ancient mud indicates dramatic ecological shifts. Crops disappear from the environmental record. Wild reeds spread into abandoned farmland. Waterborne disease may have followed. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse, and scholars still debate how sudden the final disaster truly was. Some researchers argue for centuries of environmental pressure gradually weakening the kingdom until political structures simply failed under strain. Others believe one especially devastating river shift triggered a chain reaction from which recovery became impossible. There are even disputed theories involving distant volcanic eruptions altering rainfall patterns across entire regions. The evidence remains incomplete because the river itself destroyed or buried much of the proof. That is the strange cruelty of water as an archaeological force. Fire preserves, deserts preserve, ice preserves, rivers erase. They carry away archives, they grind walls into sediment, they relocate the dead. They transform carefully built human geography into something unreadable. Entire capitals can disappear beneath meters of silt until later civilizations unknowingly build over them. By the time anyone understands what has happened, the original landscape may already be gone. Yet traces survive in unexpected ways. A line of trees growing unusually green across dry terrain may follow a buried canal. Slight rises in farmland can mark collapsed architecture underneath. Ancient fish bones reveal changing river ecology. Mineral deposits inside human teeth preserve clues about migration and famine. Even insects trapped in flood sediments help reconstruct vanished climates. Modern archaeology increasingly resembles forensic reconstruction after an ancient crime scene washed repeatedly by water. And still the picture remains incomplete. The kingdom appears to have flourished for centuries before the disaster fully unfolded. At its height, it controlled trade routes, managed irrigation systems, taxed agricultural production, and coordinated labor across enormous stretches of river plain. Its rulers built monuments intended to outlast generations. Priests aligned ceremonies with flood cycles and seasonal rhythms. Farmers trusted the river because the river made civilization possible. Without it, the surrounding landscape could not support dense populations for long. That dependence created enormous wealth. It also created enormous vulnerability. Because rivers do not care about kingdoms. They ignore borders, dynasties, tax systems, armies, and sacred architecture. They move according to rainfall, gravity, sediment, erosion, climate, and time. Human beings often mistake temporary stability for permanence. Ancient civilizations repeatedly built themselves around rivers because no other environment offered so much abundance so quickly. Crops thrived in rich floodplain soil. Transportation became easier. Trade expanded. Populations grew. Rulers concentrated power. But the same force that creates a civilization can eventually unmake it. The people living beside this river almost certainly believed they understood it. They tracked seasonal floods. They built embankments. They dredged canals. They performed rituals intended to maintain harmony between water, land, and state authority. For generations, those systems probably worked well enough to reinforce confidence. Success itself became dangerous. Cities expanded farther into vulnerable terrain. More fields depended on delicate water management. Larger populations required greater agricultural stability. Complexity deepened dependence. Then the river changed. At first, perhaps only subtly, a neglected canal, floodwater arriving at the wrong time, villages relocated after bank erosion, officials reporting lower harvests upstream, traders forced onto longer routes, priests interpreting strange seasonal behavior as divine displeasure, small disruptions accumulating quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life. The kingdom may not even have realized that the foundations beneath it were already beginning to dissolve, because collapses often look manageable while they are happening. Only later does the pattern become visible. The kingdom begins with mud. Not the dead mud of a drowned ruin, but the rich, dark, living mud left behind when floodwater retreats and the world seems newly made. Each year, the river spills across the plain and lays down a skin of fertile silt over the land. What looks like destruction from a distance becomes renewal when the water withdraws. Seeds take root quickly. Grasses rise. Herd animals return. Fish remain trapped in shrinking pools. Birds gather in such numbers that the sky itself seems to move. For the earliest farming communities, this is not simply a useful landscape. It is a promise. People settle where the ground is slightly raised above the floodline, close enough to reach the water but high enough to survive its moods. Their first houses are probably simple, made from reed, timber, packed earth, and sun-dried brick. They store grain in pits lined against dampness. They keep animals near the edges of cultivated land. They learn which fields flood first, which stay wet longest, and which must be planted immediately after the river falls. The calendar grows out of observation before it becomes royal administration. The first law of the kingdom is not written by a king, it is written by water. Over generations, the settlements thicken. A hamlet becomes a village becomes a town. Paths between towns become routes of exchange. Boats move more efficiently than carts across the flat country, so the river becomes both road and granary, timber, stone, salt, fish, grain, textiles, metals, and pottery move along its channels. News travels with traders, marriages connect settlements, local chiefs become regional rulers. Somewhere in this slow accumulation of food, labour, ritual, and authority, a kingdom begins to form. What survives in the record suggests that this was not an accidental rise. The people of the river learned to organise water with remarkable skill. They cut canals from natural channels, raised levees from packed earth, cleared silt from irrigation ditches, and guided seasonal overflow toward fields that needed it most. None of this required modern machines, but it demanded coordination. Someone had to decide when a canal was repaired, who supplied labour, who received water first, and what happened when a village upstream took more than its share. Water management quietly becomes government. A ruler who controls irrigation does not merely control crops. He controls time, labour, survival, and obligation. He can demand workers for canal maintenance and reward loyal communities with access to better fields. He can store surplus grain and redistribute it after a poor flood. He can fund temples, support craftspeople, feed soldiers, and sponsor monuments, because the river produces more than each household needs for itself. The kingdom is born not only from conquest, but from the management of abundance. This is one of the oldest patterns in human history. River valleys invite central authority because water is both generous and difficult. Too little coordination and fields dry out. Too much water in the wrong place and villages drown. Sediment builds up in channels. Banks collapse. Ditches clog. Disputes multiply. A riverine kingdom must constantly negotiate with nature, and those negotiations create officials, measurements, boundaries, taxes, records, and eventually ideology. The king becomes more than a military leader. He becomes the guarantor of order against watery chaos. Temples rise near the river not only because cities grow there, but because sacred power gathers where survival feels most uncertain. Priests track seasons, stars, moon phases, flood heights, and agricultural festivals. Offerings are made at moments when the river rises or withdraws. The annual flood may be imagined as blessing, judgment, renewal, or the breath of a divine force moving through the land. Scholars still debate how directly these beliefs shaped policy, because ritual texts rarely describe ordinary irrigation work in practical detail, but the connection between water and authority is unmistakable. A failed flood is never only a weather event. It is a political and spiritual crisis. At the kingdom's height, the river plain must have been a place of extraordinary activity. Dawn begins with the sound of animals and water birds. Farmers walk along raised field boundaries with tools over their shoulders. Boats push away from muddy landings before the heat grows severe. Potters knead clay taken from banks where the river has exposed fine sediment. Brickmakers lay rows of wet blocks in the sun. Children gather reeds. Fishermen mend nets. Officials count baskets of grain. Scribes, where writing is used, mark quantities that will never matter to later legend but matter deeply to daily survival. The kingdom's wealth is not hidden in gold first. It is stored in grain. Grain is civilization in concentrated form. It can be counted, taxed, transported, rationed, stolen, and sacrificed. It feeds workers who build walls and temples. It supports specialists who do not farm. It allows soldiers to campaign away from home. It can be exchanged for materials the floodplain lacks. The river makes grain possible at scale, and grain makes the state possible. Yet this prosperity depends on a delicate balance that is easy to miss when the system is working. Fields need predictable inundation, but not prolonged submergence. Canals need enough flow to irrigate crops, but not so much that banks fail. Settlements need access to the river, but not exposure to its full force. Ports need channels deep enough for boats, but stable enough not to wander away. Every success pulls people closer to danger. The earliest kings probably understand some of this. They may not know the geology beneath the floodplain, or the long history of abandoned channels hidden below their feet, but they know erosion, they know famine, they know that a levee breach can undo months of labour. They know that a canal neglected for one season may require 10 times the work the next year. The river is familiar. but familiarity is not control. A lesser-known detail in river kingdoms is how much of their power can depend on maintenance that leaves almost no grand archaeological trace. A palace foundation may survive in ruined form for thousands of years, but the daily clearing of a canal disappears almost as soon as it is done. The repair of a breached embankment may save thousands of lives and leave only a faint irregularity in buried sediment. The kingdom's real skeleton is not always its monuments. It is the network of ditches. Levees, storage yards, landing places, flood basins, and field boundaries that made ordinary life function. This is why archaeologists study abandoned channels with such intensity. A buried watercourse can explain why a city stood where it did, why a road bent around a vanished bend, why a temple faced a direction that seems meaningless today, or why a settlement suddenly declined after centuries of prosperity. The river supplied geography, and geography supplied meaning. At first, the kingdom's relationship with the river appears triumphant. The rulers build beside it because it announces their power. They command labour because the fields can feed that labour. They celebrate the flood because the flood returns. They imagine continuity because their grandparents and great-grandparents saw the same waters rise and fall. A child born in a riverside city might believe the world has always worked this way. Water, mud, seed, harvest, tax, festival, flood again. But the river plain remembers older movements that no human lifetime can easily measure. Long before the kingdom rises, the river has shifted across the land many times. Its channels have migrated, split, rejoined, and died. In some centuries, the main current may have flowed miles away from where later people built their towns. A river carrying heavy sediment slowly raises its own bed over time, because silt accumulates inside the channel, as well as across the floodplain. Eventually, the river may sit higher than parts of the surrounding land, held in place by natural levees and human reinforcement. That arrangement can endure for generations. It can also fail catastrophically. The kingdom grows during one of the river's gifts, a period stable enough for agriculture, transport, and authority to mature. But stability on a floodplain is often temporary, even when it lasts longer than memory. So the kingdom flourishes, its fields widen, its towns grow louder, its rulers grow more confident, its monuments become heavier, more permanent, more certain of themselves. The river is praised as provider, defended as boundary, used as highway, worshipped as force, measured as resource, and trusted as destiny. And all the while, beneath the banks, under the harbours, inside the canals, pressure gathers grain by grain. A river is never one thing for long. To the people who live beside it, it may appear to have a personality generous in one season, sluggish in another, dangerous after heavy rain, strangely low in a year when fields begin to crack. But what seems like mood is movement. Water responds to forces far beyond the horizon. Rains falling in distant highlands, snowmelt from mountains no farmer has ever seen, storms moving through upper valleys, forests cut far upstream, earthquakes changing slopes by a fraction, sediment gathering unseen beneath the current. The river that glides past a village is only the visible surface of a much larger system. For a kingdom built on its banks, that system becomes fate. The seasonal rhythm is the first rhythm people learn. There is the waiting time, when the heat sharpens and stored grain begins to matter. There is the first sign of rising water, perhaps a dampness in low channels, a change in the smell of the air, a line of debris floating where the current runs faster. Then comes the swelling. The river spreads outward, not always violently, but with irresistible patience. It enters ditches, flood basins, reed beds, pasture land. It stains the fields brown. It lifts boats closer to doorways. It covers tracks, boundaries, and graves. For weeks or months, the kingdom becomes partly aquatic. Then the water falls. This falling is as important as the rising. Too fast, and the soil may not be renewed deeply enough. Too slow, and planting is delayed. Too high, and settlements are damaged. Too low, and irrigation fails. The whole agricultural year depends on timing that feels reliable, only because people remember the years when it worked. A few poor floods can strain a village. A series of poor or excessive floods can weaken a state. What survives in the record suggests that the kingdom's administrators watched the river closely. They likely measured flood heights at fixed points, noted when channels opened or closed, and tracked the amount of grain owed from each district according to expected productivity. In many ancient river societies, officials learned that land was not just territory, it was potential yield, and potential yield rose or fell with water. A field that looks rich on a map can become useless if the river abandons the canal that feeds it. A low marsh can become valuable if a new channel brings controlled flow. The state's understanding of itself is therefore always a little behind the river's latest decision. The river's danger is not limited to dramatic floods. Some of its most destructive work happens quietly through silt. Silt is the kingdom's blessing. It fertilizes fields, builds levees naturally, provides clay for bricks and pottery, and helps renew exhausted soil. But silt is also the river's slow weapon. Every flood deposits more of it. Every irrigation ditch gathers it. Every canal requires clearing. If sediment is not removed, channels become shallower, slower, and more likely to overflow or clog. A water system that once fed thousands of hectares can gradually lose capacity until more labour is needed simply to preserve yesterday's harvest. This is where abundance begins to demand discipline. The more successful the kingdom becomes, the larger its irrigation system grows. The larger the system grows, the more maintenance it requires. The more maintenance it requires, the more dependent communities become on centralized coordination. Prosperity does not free the kingdom from the river. It binds the kingdom more tightly to it. There is a strange paradox in this. A small village can sometimes move when a riverbank becomes unsafe. It can abandon one field and cultivate another. It can rebuild houses farther back from the channel. But a kingdom cannot move so easily. Its temples are fixed. Its royal compounds are fixed. Its cemeteries, granaries, roads, boundary markers, administrative centres, and sacred landscapes accumulate weight. The more impressive the civilization becomes, the less flexible it may be in the face of environmental change. Scholars still debate how much ancient rulers understood about long-term channel migration. They certainly knew rivers eroded banks and changed course locally. They watched islands appear and disappear. They saw old bends cut off, forming stagnant pools. They dealt with breaches and diversions. But recognizing a local hazard is not the same as understanding that the main artery of a kingdom might eventually leave its established path or carve through inhabited land on a scale beyond repair. Rivers that flow through low, flat plains often develop meanders. These bends migrate gradually as water cuts into the outer bank and deposits sediment on the inner bank. Over time, a bend may become so exaggerated that the river cuts through the narrow neck of land between two curves, abandoning the old loop. This creates an oxbow lake, a crescent of trapped water where the main current once flowed. To a fisherman, it is a new pond. To an administrator, it may mean a changed boundary. To a city that depended on the old channel for transport, it can be the beginning of decline. But the greater danger is avulsion, the sudden or semi-sudden shift of a river into a new course. Avulsion often happens when sediment raises the riverbed above surrounding land, making another path steeper or easier during flood. Once water breaks through a weak point, it may rush into an older channel, a low basin, or a man-made canal, enlarging the new route until the former main course loses flow. In some cases, a river can rearrange the geography of a region within a generation. For people living there, the change may appear both natural and impossible, like the ground itself forgetting its shape. The kingdom's river seems to have carried this possibility inside it for a long time. The floodplain was not a flat blank surface, though it may look that way to modern eyes. It was a palimpsest of older channels, levees, back swamps, abandoned lakes, sandy ridges, clay basins, and subtle elevations. The people of the kingdom built across that inherited landscape, sometimes taking advantage of older river features without knowing their deeper history. A settlement might rise on a natural levee formed by a channel dead for centuries. A canal might follow a low path once carved by an earlier flood. A road might trace slightly higher ground between wetlands. Human planning and ancient river memory became interwoven. One lesser-known detail is that abandoned channels can remain dangerous long after they appear dead. They may look like shallow depressions, seasonal ponds, or harmless reed beds, but during extreme floods, they can reactivate, offering water an old route across the plain. A channel forgotten by people may not be forgotten by gravity. When enough water arrives, the river can find its former path again. This is one reason the kingdom's collapse is difficult to reconstruct. The river did not simply rise like water in a bowl. It likely exploited weakness already written into the land. It may have broken through neglected levees, overwhelmed canals, or reoccupied ancient channels invisible to anyone without deep geological knowledge. Floodwater does not choose the most symbolic route. It chooses the easiest one. To the people watching it happen, the first signs may have been ordinary enough to dismiss. A bend eating into farmland more quickly than before, a ferry landing becoming unusable because the current shifted, a canal silting up despite repeated clearing, a low village flooding twice in a decade after generations of safety, a new sandbar forming near a river port, a district reporting that the water no longer reaches certain fields. Each problem can be treated as local, temporary, manageable. But when the underlying river system begins reorganizing, local repairs become a losing argument with time. The kingdom's officials may have responded with more labor, more embankments, more dredging, more orders sent to villages, more tax demands to fund repairs, more ritual appeals to restore balance. For a while, this may even have worked. Ancient societies were not passive victims of nature. They adapted constantly, often with impressive practical intelligence. The evidence remains incomplete, but nothing suggests that the kingdom simply watched disaster approach without resistance. Yet resistance has limits. A river carries not only water but force, sediment, disease, opportunity, and memory. It can nourish a field in one season and bury it under sterile sand in the next. It can make a port wealthy, then leave it stranded inland. It can protect a capital by serving as a moat, then undermine its walls from below. It can connect distant communities, then isolate them when channels fail. The kingdom's tragedy is not that its people lived beside a river. Nearly all great early civilizations did. The tragedy is that they succeeded so well that their entire world became organized around a living force that never promised to remain where it was. And before the kingdom could be swallowed, it first had to become heavy enough to sink. The cities rose because the ground seemed to welcome them. Along the higher banks, where the flood left soil dark but did not linger too long, builders found exactly what a growing kingdom needed. There was clay for bricks, reeds for roofing and mats, fish in the channels, pasture on the margins, and fields close enough to feed dense populations. Boats could arrive with grain, timber, stone, metal, salt, and people. A settlement placed near the river was never isolated. It stood on the kingdom's main road, its market corridor, its ritual axis, and its source of life. So the towns became permanent. At first, permanence was practical. Houses were rebuilt in the same places because wells, paths, fields, landing places, and family ties already existed there. Granaries grew larger because harvests were worth storing. Workshops gathered near transport routes because finished goods could move by water more easily than by cart. Administrative buildings appeared where taxes could be counted and redistributed. Temples stood where ritual and authority could be seen together, elevated above the ordinary houses but still close to the river that made the whole system believable. Over time, permanence became a statement. Mud brick walls thickened, platforms rose above the floodplain, streets hardened through use, warehouses lined ports, courtyards filled with jars, baskets, tools, animals, and the smoke of cooking fires. People repaired the same rooms their grandparents had built, and those repairs slowly lifted the settlement upward, layer by layer, creating mounds of human occupation. To later archaeologists, these mounds are clues. To the people who lived on them, they were simply home. Yet the very places that offered the greatest rewards often carried the greatest risk. A natural levee beside a major channel is an attractive place to build because it sits slightly higher than surrounding flood basins. It gives access to water without immediate marsh. It drains better after inundation. It may remain habitable while lower fields disappear under seasonal floods. But a natural levee exists because the river built it, and what the river builds, the river can cut away. The kingdom's cities were not foolishly placed. They were intelligently placed according to the needs and knowledge of their time. That is what makes their vulnerability more unsettling. They were not monuments to ignorance, but a successful adaptation inside a dangerous environment. The same bank that allowed a port to flourish could later collapse, undercut by a stronger current. The same canal that fed fields could later become a route for destructive floodwater. The same low basin that stored excess water could become a permanent swamp. What survives in the record suggests that urban growth intensified the kingdom's dependence on fragile infrastructure. A village can survive partial isolation. A major city cannot. Cities require constant inflow food, fuel, water, raw materials, labour, animals, building supplies, and information. Their inhabitants are specialists as much as farmers, potters, priests, scribes, soldiers, merchants, weavers, boatmen, brickmakers, administrators, servants, and labourers. Every person not directly producing food depends on the agricultural system functioning beyond the city walls. This means that when the river begins to change, the city feels it in stages. The first stage may be inconvenience. Boats cannot reach a landing as easily. Silt builds up near a quay, a market shifts to another bank, a canal needs clearing twice in a season instead of once. Then comes expense. Labour has to be diverted from farming or building into maintenance. Officials demand more workers. Villagers complain. Fields at the margin produce less. Grain deliveries become irregular. The city still stands, still prays, still trades, still counts taxes. But beneath the routines, strain begins to gather. The second stage is reorganization. Storehouses are moved, Roads are repaired along higher ground. New embankments are raised. Poorer households abandon flood-prone quarters. Cemeteries shift location. Workshops move away from collapsing banks. In archaeological layers, these changes may appear as altered building patterns, hastily repaired floors, changing pottery distributions, or sudden deposits of river sand inside spaces that were once dry. The third stage is fear. Floodwater entering a city does not behave like clean water poured into a vessel. It carries mud, debris, dead animals, insects, sewage, broken timber, uprooted reeds, and sometimes bodies. It undermines walls from below. It fills storage pits. It contaminates wells. It turns streets into channels. When it withdraws, it leaves behind not restoration but rot. Food spoils. Mosquitoes multiply. Disease spreads. Bricks made of dried mud soften, slump, and crack. A settlement built from the floodplain is vulnerable to being returned to it. Scholars still debate whether the kingdom's principal cities were destroyed by sudden inundation or slowly made unlivable by repeated smaller disasters. The evidence remains uneven. Some sites show abrupt flood deposits, suggesting violent water events. Others show abandonment over time, with buildings repaired, reused, reduced, and finally deserted. This variation matters because collapse rarely reaches every place at once. A capital may decline while provincial towns continue. A port may vanish while inland villages adapt. A temple may remain active long after the administrative system around it has weakened. The river did not swallow the kingdom like a monster taking one bite. It likely consumed it unevenly. One lesser-known detail of mud brick cities is how difficult they can be to recognize after water damage. Stone ruins announce themselves. Mud brick ruins often dissolve into the soil from which they came. If a flood erodes a wall, the wall may not leave a dramatic pile of blocks. It may become a smear of clay, a change in soil texture, a faint line visible only when excavated carefully. Entire neighborhoods can collapse into layers that look almost natural unless archaeologists identify floor surfaces, hearths, post holes, ash lenses, or artifact concentrations. This is why a swallowed kingdom can hide in plain sight. A farmer ploughing a field may cross a vanished street without knowing it. A low rise may contain collapsed rooms. A patch of unusually dense pottery may mark a marketplace. A darker band in an exposed bank may be the floor of a house where people once cooked, slept, argued, stored grain, and waited for news of the river. The kingdom does not disappear because nothing remains. It disappears because what remains has been translated into mud. At the height of urban confidence, however, no one sees the city this way. People experience it as solid. They see gates, platforms, walls, courtyards, roofs, shrines, and busy landings. They know which families live near the granary, which merchants control boat traffic, which priests manage offerings, which officials can ruin a farmer with a bad measurement. Children grow up knowing the shortcuts between houses and the safest path during floods. The city is not an abstract archaeological site. It is a complete world of habits, and habit is powerful. A population may continue to live in a dangerous place because danger arrives intermittently. While livelihood is daily, one bad flood does not erase generations of memory. People rebuild because fields are still nearby. They rebuild because ancestors are buried there. They rebuild because the temple remains. They rebuild because leaving means becoming dependent on strangers elsewhere. They rebuild because everyone else is rebuilding too. The kingdom's rulers also have reasons to insist on permanence. A royal city cannot easily admit that its site is failing, Authority depends on confidence, and confidence depends on visible continuity. Processions must still occur. Storehouses must still be filled. Officials must still issue orders. Builders may raise platforms higher, reinforce banks, or shift important structures inward from the river. But these adaptations can become symbols of resilience right up until they become evidence of desperation. No single explanation fully accounts for why some cities endure environmental stress while others collapse. Wealth can help, but wealth may also delay necessary retreat. Strong government can coordinate repairs, but it can also force people to maintain failing systems too long. Religious attachment can strengthen community, but it can make abandonment unthinkable. The very institutions that help a city survive ordinary floods may trap it in the path of extraordinary change. So the kingdom built upward and outward. It laid streets across old flood deposits. It raised walls on earlier walls. It stored grain in buildings close enough to water for transport and dangerously close to water in disaster. It expanded into zones that had once been marginal, but now seemed safe because memory was short and the river had behaved for generations. It placed faith in embankments, canals, officials, rituals, and the accumulated success of the past. The cities looked permanent because they were made to look permanent. But permanence on a floodplain is always negotiated, never guaranteed. Beneath every platform, older sediments told a quieter story. Water had been here before, and water could return. The kingdom's builders knew the river as provider and obstacle, but the ground beneath them held a longer memory than any archive. It remembered channels that no longer flowed, floods no one had recorded, and landscapes that had changed before a single brick was laid. By the time the great cities reached their fullest form, they were not standing outside danger. They were standing inside a pause. The first warnings were probably not dramatic enough to be remembered as warnings. A kingdom does not wake one morning and find its river suddenly transformed beyond recognition. More often, the earlier signs appear as annoyances, expenses, rumours, and local misfortunes. A bend cuts deeper into farmland after a flood season. A ferry crossing becomes dangerous because the current has shifted toward the outer bank. A canal that once carried water easily now needs clearing again and again. A village that had stood dry for generations finds water at its threshold twice within a few years. Officials mark it down as damage. Farmers call it bad luck. Priests may search for meaning. Engineers, if the kingdom has them in organized form, send laborers with baskets, wooden tools, and orders to repair what the river has undone. For a time, this is enough. The old system absorbs disruption because river societies are built to absorb disruption. Embankments fail and are rebuilt. Fields flood and are replanted. Silt blocks ditches and is removed. A warehouse wall collapses and is patched. People living beside great rivers do not expect complete safety. They expect work. Their civilization is a long argument with water, and many generations before them have won that argument well enough to pass the land on. But the strange thing about decline is that it can hide inside maintenance. When the same repairs are needed more often, when the labour demanded by water grows heavier, when the cost of preserving ordinary life rises each season, the kingdom may still appear strong from the outside, its temples still stand, its rulers still command, markets still open, boats still move through the channels that remain navigable, but more of the kingdom's energy is being spent simply preventing loss. Expansion slows without anyone declaring it. Surplus narrows. Local officials become harsher because the numbers no longer add up. Communities begin to argue over access to water, over labour obligations, over whose fields will be protected first and whose will be sacrificed. What survives in the record suggests that such pressures often leave indirect traces. A settlement may shrink without evidence of attack. Storage facilities may be repaired in cheaper materials. Imported goods may become less common in later layers. Cemeteries may show changes in diet or health. Irrigation canals may be recut at odd angles, suggesting that people are chasing a changing water source. In written records, where they survive, the signs can be even quieter, fewer deliveries. Altered tax assessments, abandoned estates, repeated references to repair, or sudden gaps where bureaucracy once seemed continuous. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is familiar enough to be troubling. Environmental instability rarely arrives alone. A difficult flood season can mean reduced harvests. Reduced harvest can mean lower tax receipts. Lower tax receipts can mean fewer workers supported by the state. Fewer workers can mean weaker canal maintenance. Weaker canal maintenance can mean worse harvest the next year. A river problem becomes an administrative problem, then an economic problem, then a political problem, at some point. The boundary between natural disaster and human failure begins to blur. This is where scholars still debate the kingdom's path toward collapse. Some see the river as the decisive force, a physical transformation so powerful that no administration could have resisted it. Others emphasize the kingdom's internal fragility, elite competition, overextension, rigid taxation, weakened local loyalty, or poor management of irrigation. The most cautious answer is that these explanations do not exclude one another. A strong, flexible society can survive many environmental shocks. A strained society may be broken by a shock that earlier generations would have endured. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence because the river did not act on an empty landscape. It acted on a human system already full of obligations, inequalities, ambitions, and limits. One of the most surprising clues may come not from ruined walls, but from abandoned fields. Fields are among the hardest human creations to preserve because they are meant to be worked, flooded, dried, replanted, and reshaped. Yet ancient agricultural landscapes sometimes survive as faint patterns visible from above raised lines, rectangular divisions, old canal traces, soil marks where water once flowed. In some regions, remote sensing reveals entire networks of vanished irrigation, more extensive than what can be seen from ground level. These ghost fields show that people invested labour in places later deserted, and their abandonment can mark the moment when water control failed or became too costly. A field abandoned because of war may leave little different from a field abandoned because of salinity, flooding, or channel loss. But when many fields across a floodplain fall out of use while river deposits change at the same time, the landscape begins to speak. It suggests not a single burned city, but a wider unravelling. There are also signs in the soil itself. Repeated irrigation in hot, dry climates can bring dissolved salts toward the surface as water evaporates. Over time, salinity can reduce crop yields unless drainage is carefully managed. A kingdom dependent on irrigation has to fight not only floods, but the chemistry of its own success. In some ancient river civilizations, shifts in crop choices may reflect growing salinity stress. As farmers move toward more tolerant plants when traditional staples decline, whether this specific kingdom experienced severe salinization remains debated, but the possibility adds another layer to the problem. Water can ruin land both by absence and by excess. The river's banks would have offered warnings too. Bank erosion is intimate destruction. It does not begin with the whole city falling in. It begins with a crack near the edge, a tree leaning toward the water, a strip of field gone after the flood, a storehouse rebuilt farther inland. Families living near the channel would notice before officials did. They would know which paths had narrowed, which graves were too close to the edge, which landing places had become unsafe. The river would take small things first, a patch of reeds, a garden wall, a corner of a field, a shrine built by someone's grandfather. Then, after a season of heavy flow, it might take a house. People adapt to such losses until adaptation itself becomes a way of life. Perhaps some villages moved gradually, dismantling reusable beams, carrying household gods or ancestral objects, leaving behind broken pottery, collapsed ovens, and the heavier things too difficult to transport. Perhaps others stayed too long. The archaeological record cannot easily capture hesitation. It preserves the final layer, not the arguments before departure. What it can show, sometimes, is disorder-hurried repairs, mixed deposits, valuables hidden and never recovered. Domestic spaces filled with flood silt instead of clean abandonment debris. Disease may have been another warning, although it is often harder to detect. Stagnant water after irregular flooding can create breeding grounds for insects and contaminate drinking supplies. Floods can spread waste through settlements, ruin stored grain, and force people into crowded temporary shelters. Human remains may reveal stress through signs of malnutrition or illness, but connecting those signs directly to river change is difficult. Still, it would be naive to imagine the disaster only as moving water and collapsing walls. A river out of balance changes the entire ecology of human life. The warning signs also travelled through rumour. A kingdom is held together by information as much as roads and canals. Boatmen carry news from upstream. Traders report which ports are silting. Farmers complain about water theft or failed embankments. Priests hear offerings increase after local disasters. Officials receive reports that may be minimized, exaggerated, delayed, or shaped to avoid blame. By the time the capital understands the scale of the problem, the river may already have rewritten parts of the kingdom beyond easy recovery. There is a dry understatement hidden in many ancient bureaucracies. Catastrophe often enters the record as an accounting problem. A village disappears, and what remains is not a lament but a missing tax line. A canal fails, and the document notes labour reassignment. A flood destroys grain, and the archive records shortage, debt, or exemption. Human terror becomes administrative adjustment. That coldness can mislead later readers into underestimating the suffering behind the numbers. Yet somewhere between the numbers and the mud, the pattern becomes undeniable. The old confidence weakens. The river that once confirmed the kingdom's order now exposes its limits. Every repair proves that authority still functions, but every repeated repair proves that authority is being tested. The land itself begins demanding more than the state can easily provide. And as the warnings multiply, one truth becomes harder to avoid. The kingdom has built its life around a river whose past behaviour no longer guarantees its future. The decisive change may have begun with a season that seemed merely severe. Heavy rains fall somewhere far beyond the kingdom's familiar horizon. In the upper reaches of the river system, tributaries swell, hillsides loosen, sediment pours into the channels. The river gathers speed and weight before anyone downstream understands what is coming. By the time the first signs arrive in the kingdom's heartland, the flood is already a moving history of distant weather, carrying broken branches, uprooted plants, mud from highland slopes, and the force of places most farmers will never see. At first, people respond as they always have. Boats are pulled higher, animals are driven toward safer ground, grain stores are checked, Weak points in embankments are watched. Officials call for labour. The river is high, perhaps alarmingly high, but high water is not unknown. The old system has survived high water before. Then the river finds a weakness. It may be a low point in a levee, softened by burrowing animals and years of seepage. It may be a neglected canal whose banks have already slumped. It may be an old abandoned channel lying almost invisible beneath reeds and seasonal pasture. It may be a bend where the current has been cutting harder year after year, narrowing the strip of land that holds the main flow in place. No one watching from the bank needs to understand the full geometry of the floodplain. They see only the moment when water begins going where it should not go. A breach is not always spectacular in its first minutes. A trickle becomes a stream widens, the edge collapses, brown water pours through, dragging soil with it, deepening its own path as it runs. People arrive with baskets, mats, bundles of reeds, timber stakes, anything heavy enough to slow the flow. For a while, human urgency meets river force at close range. Hands pack mud into gaps that water removes almost immediately. Orders are shouted over the sound of current. More labourers come, more earth is thrown, the river takes all of it. Once enough water escapes, the breach becomes self-enlarging. The new flow scours the opening, lowers the path, and draws still more current from the main channel. If it enters an older depression or abandoned course, the river may suddenly discover a route more favourable than the one it has occupied for generations. Gravity does not honour tradition. The old channel may still carry water, but the balance has shifted. A part of the river has turned away. For the kingdom, this is the beginning of geographic betrayal. What survives in sediment suggests that major changes of this kind can leave abrupt layers coarse sand where fine flood silt once settled. Chaotic deposits full of plant debris, sudden erosion cutting through older occupation surfaces. To archaeologists, these layers are signatures of energy. They mark water moving with enough force to carry heavier material across places that were once fields, yards, streets, or canal beds. They do not preserve panic directly, but they preserve the conditions that would have produced it. Scholars still debate whether the river's great turning happened in a single extreme event or through a sequence of related floods. The distinction matters scientifically, but for people living through it, the experience may have blurred. One year brings a damaging breach. Repairs are made. The next flood reopens it. A new channel deepens. A district loses irrigation. Another district floods too often. Within a generation, what began as emergency becomes geography. Children grow up beside water their grandparents remember as a field. The kingdom's maps no longer match the ground. A river changing course does not simply move water from one line to another. It rearranges everything that depends on water's position. Ports lose depth or become stranded. Roads that once led to landings now end in marsh. Fields designed for controlled irrigation either dry out or drown. Villages that were safely inland may find themselves beside a destructive current. Settlements built for access to the old channel may become isolated from trade. Boundary markers lose meaning. Tax districts become fiction. The turning of the channel is therefore not only a hydrological event, it is an administrative crisis, a spiritual crisis, and a crisis of imagination. The kingdom's rulers likely tried to force the river back, or at least divide and manage the new flow. Ancient states were capable of large-scale hydraulic labour when they could mobilize enough people. They could raise embankments, cut diversion channels, block smaller breaches, and reinforce vulnerable banks with timber, brush, stone where available, and packed earth. The question is not whether they responded. The question is whether the response could match the scale and timing of the change. No single explanation fully accounts for the failure, but several pressures may have converged. If harvests were already declining, fewer surplus resources were available for emergency labour. If local elites competed for protection, repairs may have favoured politically important districts over vulnerable margins. If the river had entered a lower course, blocking it may have required work far beyond what traditional methods could accomplish. If floods continued in successive seasons, partially completed repairs may have failed before they became effective. There is also the problem of belief. A society accustomed to managing floods may interpret even serious failures as temporary disturbances within a known pattern. Leaders may assume that enough labour can restore the old order, because enough labour always has. Farmers may resist abandoning fields that have fed their families for generations. Priests may intensify rituals not because they are naive, but because ritual is one of the ways communities respond to danger when practical measures are uncertain. People rarely understand they are living through a permanent transformation until after permanence has already arrived. One lesser-known detail about river avulsions is that the old channel does not necessarily vanish at once. It may continue carrying reduced flow for years or decades, enough to sustain some activities, but not enough to maintain the full system built around it. This partial survival can be misleading. A city may still have water at its landing, but fewer boats. A canal may still function, but less reliably. Fields may still produce, but not as before. The kingdom does not fall from abundance into emptiness overnight. It enters a grey zone where every institution behaves as if recovery is possible, while the physical basis of recovery weakens. That grey zone is where people suffer most quietly. A farmer downstream from the abandoned channel may face drought in the middle of a floodplain. His irrigation ditch no longer fills at the right time. He digs deeper, petitions officials, borrows grain, sells animals, or sends family members elsewhere for work. Another farmer near the new channel loses fields to uncontrolled flooding. He has too much water, then disease, then ruined seed. The kingdom's old systems of redistribution may try to help both, but their needs contradict each other. One district demands more water, another demands protection from it. The river has divided the kingdom's interests. In the cities, the turning channel changes sound and smell before it changes politics openly. A port that once echoed with traffic becomes quieter. Mudflats widen where boats used to moor. Elsewhere, new wetlands bring insects and stagnant pools close to neighbourhoods never built for them. Fresh deposits alter the paths people take through the city. Flood marks stain walls higher than memory expects. Wells taste different. Foundations shift. The landscape that anchored identity becomes uncertain beneath daily life. The royal court cannot ignore this for long. Messengers arrive from districts with conflicting reports. Some describe devastation, others describe opportunity, because a new channel may enrich lands previously marginal. This is another complication. Disaster is rarely uniform. While the kingdom as a whole weakens, some local groups may benefit from changed water, new ports may emerge, new agricultural zones may open, families with flexible networks may relocate and prosper. The river destroys one geography while creating another. Political authority, however, often remains tied to the old one. The king's legitimacy depends on the promise that the world remains ordered. The river's turning makes that promise harder to sustain. If the royal capital was symbolically linked to the old channel, the damage would be deeper than logistics. Processions, temple alignments, sacred landing places, flood festivals, Ancestral tombs and foundation myths may all have assumed a particular relationship between city and water. When that relationship breaks, the landscape itself seems to contradict royal ideology. A ruler can command soldiers, scribes, and labourers. He cannot command a river to remember his ancestors. The evidence remains incomplete, and it may never reveal the exact year or sequence of the turning, but the physical clues point toward transformation on a scale that would have been impossible to treat as ordinary for long. Layers of flood sediment, abandoned canals, shifted settlement patterns, and broken lines of communication suggest that the river did not merely damage the kingdom. It changed the terms under which the kingdom could exist. The river that had once gathered people into a single political world now began pulling that world apart. And once water had chosen a new path, every wall, oath, archive, and prayer built around the old path became a little less real. Water enters a city by many doors. It comes first through the obvious places: river gates, drainage channels, low streets near the landing, storage yards built close to the bank for convenience in ordinary times. Then it finds the hidden weaknesses. It rises through saturated ground. It seeps beneath walls. It follows old ditches and construction trenches. It pushes through animal burrows, cracked foundations, abandoned wells, and the gaps where earlier repairs were made in haste. A city can face a flood from the front and still be defeated from underneath. The first defense is height. People carry goods to roofs, platforms, upper rooms, temple terraces, and raised granary floors. Grain jars are sealed if there is time. Animals are moved toward higher courtyards. Boats become bridges between neighborhoods. Families gather what they can lift: tools, blankets, seed, small religious objects, records, ornaments, and the portable pieces of memory that make exile bearable. The heaviest things remain behind, and in archaeology, those heavy things often become the voice of abandonment. The water does not need to cover everything, to ruin everything. A storehouse flooded only knee-deep can lose its grain. A wall soaked for days can slump weeks later under its own weight. A well contaminated by flood water can become dangerous after the streets are dry. A courtyard filled with silt has to be cleared before life returns, and clearing takes labour from planting, repair, burial, and survival. Mud brick architecture, so practical in dry climates and so perfectly suited to a floodplain's materials, becomes vulnerable when water stays too long. The same clay that made the city possible begins softening back into earth. What survives in the record suggests that some settlements endured repeated flooding before final abandonment. Floors were raised, thresholds were rebuilt, drainage lines were recut, walls were patched with mixed materials. These are signs not of instant destruction, but of stubborn continuity. People tried to stay. They adapted room by room, season by season. A householder might add a new layer of packed earth to a floor after one flood, then another layer after the next. Over time, the architecture itself records a rising argument between human patience and water. But there is a point where repair becomes surrender by another name. When flood deposits inside domestic spaces become too thick, when streets fill faster than they can be cleared, when storage fails often enough to make hunger likely, staying becomes an act of desperation rather than attachment. Still, people do stay in dangerous places. They stay because their fields are nearby, because their debts are local, because their ancestors are buried under familiar mounds, because the temple remains active, because officials forbid departure, because somewhere else may be worse. Collapse is not only the moment when people leave, it is the long period when leaving becomes thinkable. Inside the kingdom's fortified centres, walls offered confidence but not certainty. Defensive walls are designed primarily against human enemies. They can also slow floodwater if built on solid foundations and maintained carefully, but they are vulnerable to undercutting, saturation, and pressure from standing water. If a river shifts close to a wall, the current can eat away the bank beneath it. A wall that resisted armies may fail quietly from below. There is a grim humility in that. The city's strongest symbol of control can be undone by mud. Scholars still debate how widespread direct urban inundation was in the kingdom's final crisis. Not every city would have drowned. Some may have declined because the river moved away, leaving them commercially stranded and agriculturally weakened. Others may have been overwhelmed by too much water. The archaeological signatures differ abandonment without thick flood deposits in one place, sudden sand layers in another, long sequences of repair and reduced occupation elsewhere. This unevenness is important. The kingdom was not swallowed as a single object. It was disassembled through different kinds of water trouble. Disease likely followed close behind. Floods create intimate forms of danger that do not leave dramatic ruins. Stored food rots. Rodents move into houses. Insects breed in pools trapped behind walls. Drinking water mixes with waste. People crowd into higher areas, bringing animals and possessions with them. Burial practices may be disrupted when graves flood or when deaths outpace ordinary ritual. Skeletal evidence, when available, can sometimes reveal stress through childhood growth interruptions, infection, or malnutrition. Though connecting individual bones to one flood season is rarely possible. The evidence remains incomplete, but the ecology of a flooded city makes suffering almost unavoidable. Famine may have been slower and worse. A flood that destroys homes is visible. A flood that destroys seed grain attacks the future. Ancient agricultural systems depend on careful preservation of seed from one harvest to the next. If stores are lost, farmers may be forced to eat what should have been planted, borrow from elites, reduce fields, sell animals, or migrate. A kingdom can survive one failed harvest through redistribution. Several failures across different districts can break the moral and administrative contract between ruler and people. If the king cannot provide grain, protection, or water, the difference between taxation and extraction becomes painfully clear. One lesser-known detail of flood disasters is that sand can be more damaging than water alone. Fine silt may renew soil, but thick deposits of coarse sand can bury fertile fields under a layer difficult to cultivate. Removing it by hand requires enormous labour. Leaving it can render land useless for years. Archaeologists who find sudden sand sheets across former occupation or agricultural zones are often looking at more than a flood marker. They are looking at lost labour, lost food, and perhaps the reason a community never returned. Water also changes movement. Roads across floodplains are fragile things, often raised just enough to remain useful under normal conditions. When flood basins expand or channels shift, roads become broken lines. A cart route may vanish beneath marsh, a causeway may wash out, a ferry point may become too dangerous. Boats can replace roads only where channels remain navigable and controlled. If the river spreads into unpredictable shallows, transport becomes slower, riskier, and more local. A kingdom that once used the river to connect its parts may find that same river creating pockets of isolation. Isolation weakens authority. Orders from the court arrive late or not at all. Tax collectors avoid dangerous districts. Local leaders improvise. Villages repair their own banks without waiting for royal permission. Communities upstream and downstream blame each other for water diversion. priests at local shrines may gain influence as central ceremonies feel less effective. Soldiers assigned to protect roads may instead be used for labour or grain enforcement. Every practical adjustment reduces the court's monopoly over solutions. And then there is the problem of fear's geography. People remember where the water reached. A stain on a wall becomes a measure of dread. A child grows up hearing that a certain quarter was safe until the night it was not. A family rebuilding a house may place the doorway higher, store grain farther from the floor, or refuse to sleep in rooms nearest the river. These small choices are not written as policy, but they reshape the city. Neighbourhoods thin. Marginal areas are left to the poor, to animals, to workshops that can tolerate risk, or to abandonment. The city becomes internally uneven, with islands of confidence surrounded by zones of memory. No single explanation fully accounts for the moment when a city stops being a city. Population decline, damaged infrastructure, failed harvests, disease, political withdrawal, and changing trade routes all reinforce one another. A settlement may still have houses and people after it has lost its urban function. A temple may still receive offerings after administration has departed. A market may continue in reduced form among ruins. Archaeologists sometimes find this late life especially difficult to interpret because collapse is not silence. It is a change in scale. The kingdom's walls then did not simply fall, they lost meaning. A wall means something when it protects a coherent community, surrounds institutions that function, guards stored wealth, and marks the boundary between order and danger. When water seeps through the foundations, when grain stores fail, when streets become channels, when officials cannot guarantee repair, the wall becomes a relic of an older confidence. It may still stand in places, impressive from a distance, but the world it enclosed has altered. The river's assault was therefore not only physical, it attacked trust. Trust that the flood would renew rather than ruin. Trust that repairs would hold. Trust that fields would produce. Trust that the king's agents understood the land. Trust that ancestors had chosen a safe place. Once those forms of trust eroded, people could continue living among the walls. But the kingdom was already becoming something else. And in the mud pressed against those walls, the river left its blunt message. The city had never been separate from the floodplain. It had only borrowed a shape from it for a while. A kingdom can survive the loss of a battle more easily than the loss of its river. Battles, even terrible ones, have edges. There is a field, a campaign, a defeated army, a victorious rival, a treaty, a revenge to plan, a new tax to impose. Political imagination understands war because war still belongs to the world of human decisions. A king can blame a general, execute a minister, raise another army, strengthen a frontier, marry into an enemy house, or proclaim that the gods will restore what was taken. War can humiliate a throne, but it does not necessarily dissolve the geography beneath it. A river crisis is different. When the channels shift, the court loses not only territory but predictability. The old surveys no longer match the fields. The old tax expectations no longer match the harvest. The old canals no longer deliver water where they should. The old ports no longer receive the same traffic. The kingdom's records, rituals, and administrative habits become maps of a landscape that is slipping away. At first, the court likely responds with command. Orders go out to repair embankments, deepen canals, count damaged fields, relocate grain, and mobilize labour. Officials arrive in districts where the damage is visible, measuring what can be measured and ignoring what cannot. Scribes reduce crisis to categories: land lost, grain owed, workers assigned, boats requisitioned, stores opened, stores missing. This is how states think under pressure. They turn fear into lists. For a time, lists help, but lists cannot make a dead channel flow. What survives in the record suggests that royal authority in river kingdoms depends on a quiet bargain. Farmers surrender grain, labour, and obedience because the state offers protection, coordination, storage, justice, and access to water. This bargain is never equal, and it is often harsh, but it remains workable as long as the state appears capable of managing conditions too large for any village alone. When the river turns against the system, that bargain weakens. If villagers must repair their own levees, find their own water, defend their own stores, and survive their own floods, the king's demands begin to sound less like order and more like hunger with a seal attached. The court's problem is therefore not only technical, it is moral. A ruler who claims cosmic order is judged by disorder. A ruler whose ceremonies promise renewal is judged by barren fields. A ruler whose officials count grain is judged by empty granaries. Ancient political authority often rests on the idea that the king mediates between human society and the forces that sustain it. When those forces become destructive, the throne must explain why the world no longer confirms its power. Scholars still debate how explicitly people blamed rulers for environmental disaster. Some communities may have seen floods as divine anger, others as unfortunate cycles, others as administrative failure, and many as all of these at once. The evidence remains incomplete because ordinary anger rarely survives in official inscriptions. Royal records tend to present control, generosity, victory, and restoration, not confusion. Yet even polished proclamations can reveal strain by what they emphasize too strongly. A ruler who boasts repeatedly of repairing canals may be ruling a land where canals repeatedly fail. The court also faces competition from its own provinces. A shifting river creates winners and losers. Districts abandoned by the main flow become poorer and angrier. Districts newly watered may gain opportunity and local influence. Officials stationed far from the capital may become more powerful because they control emergency labour and grain distribution. Provincial elites may decide that loyalty to the court is less useful than control over whatever water remains. A kingdom built around one river corridor can fragment when the river no longer reinforces the same pattern of connection. Transport failure deepens the fracture. Boats once carried orders quickly along channels that function like royal nerves. If navigation breaks, communication slows. A message delayed by washed-out routes may arrive after the crisis has changed. Tax grain that cannot be moved is grain that cannot feed workers elsewhere. Soldiers become harder to supply. Temples linked by pilgrimage or offering networks lose regular contact. The kingdom begins to feel larger and less governable at the same time. A lesser-known detail of ancient state collapse is that bureaucracy can continue after authority has already hollowed out. Officials may still write records, collect partial taxes, issue orders, and stamp goods long after the system has ceased to function coherently. The existence of administration is not proof of strength. Sometimes it is the last reflex of a weakening state, like a body still trying to breathe after the wound has already become fatal. In the royal city, this hollowing may have been subtle at first. Ceremonies continue, the court gathers, messengers arrive, storehouses open and close. Priests perform rituals at the proper times because stopping would admit a rupture too large to bear. Builders may even begin new works, partly as practical repair and partly as theatre of confidence. Ancient rulers often build in moments of crisis because construction makes authority visible. A new embankment, a raised platform, a restored temple wall. These are not only infrastructure, they are declarations that order has not failed. But public works require surplus, and surplus is exactly what the river crisis consumes. Labourers taken from villages for royal repairs are labourers not tending fields. Grain used to feed emergency workers is grain not available for famine relief. Timber used to reinforce banks is timber not used for boats or houses. Every decision solves one problem by worsening another. The court becomes trapped in arithmetic that cannot be made sacred enough to disappear. The old religious geography may have suffered too. If sacred sites depended on the river's presence, absence became a theological wound. A landing used in annual rituals might silt up. A temple once approached by boat might stand beside a stagnant channel. Flood festivals timed to familiar inundation could lose their force when the water arrived too violently, too weakly, or in the wrong place. People do not necessarily abandon belief under such pressure. Often they intensify it. But intensified ritual can also reveal anxiety. More offerings may mean deeper fear. No single explanation fully accounts for how royal legitimacy breaks. Sometimes it breaks in rebellion, sometimes in quiet disobedience, sometimes in elite rivalry masked as restoration, sometimes in migration, when people simply leave the king fewer subjects to command. In this kingdom, the river may have encouraged all of these. It did not need to overthrow the dynasty directly. It only had to make obedience less useful than survival. Imagine a village official receiving two orders in the same season. The court demands workers for a canal near the capital. The village needs those workers to repair its own breached embankment before the next rise. Obedience may mean local disaster. Disobedience may mean punishment, if punishment can still reach them. In such moments, central authority becomes negotiable, not through ideology first, but through necessity. The court may answer with coercion. It may send soldiers to secure grain, force labour, or prevent abandonment of strategic districts. This can preserve function briefly, but coercion is expensive. It also damages the very legitimacy it tries to defend. A starving community compelled to surrender grain for a distant repair project may never again see the king as guardian of order. The river's violence becomes inseparable from the state's demands, and yet it would be too simple to imagine only tyranny and failure. Some royal officials surely acted with skill and urgency. Some repairs saved lives. Some redistribution prevented famine. Some communities may have remained loyal precisely because central stores offered the only hope in a ruined season. Ancient governments were capable of both exploitation and rescue, often at the same time. The tragedy is that even competent administration can be overwhelmed when the landscape it administers is being remade faster than its institutions can adapt. By the time the court begins to lose its river, the kingdom's collapse is no longer only environmental, it has become structural. The river has damaged the fields have damaged the granaries have damaged taxation has damaged loyalty, and weakened loyalty has damaged the capacity to repair the river system. The cycle tightens. The throne may still stand. The royal name may still be spoken. Seals may still be pressed into wet clay or inked onto records. Priests may still invoke continuity. But the kingdom's power has always flowed through channels, and those channels are failing. A ruler can command people to build walls against water. He cannot command them to believe forever that the walls will hold. Long after the last officials stop counting grain, the mud keeps its own archive. It does not preserve the kingdom neatly. It does not arrange evidence in the order later historians would prefer. It breaks walls, scatters pottery, seals floors, carries bones away from where they were buried, and lays down one season of river history over another. But it preserves enough. Beneath fields, marshes, villages, and modern roads, fragments remain in patterns too deliberate to be natural and too damaged to be simple. The first clue is often elevation. In a floodplain that seems flat to the eye, a slight mound can mean centuries of human life. Each generation builds on the remains of the last. A floor is repaired, a wall collapses, a courtyard is filled, a new house rises above the old foundation. Over time, occupation creates a low hill, sometimes only a few meters higher than the surrounding fields, but high enough to matter. These mounds can survive even when the river shifts, though their edges may be bitten away or buried under later deposits. To an archaeologist, such rises are not just bumps in the land, they are condensed time. Then come the shards. Pottery is among the most faithful witnesses of vanished kingdoms because it breaks easily and survives stubbornly. A piece of painted bowl, a storage jar rim, a cooking pot blackened by use, a clay stopper, a vessel fragment stamped with a mark from an administrative office. Each small object belongs to a chain of daily actions. Someone carried water, someone stored oil, someone cooked grain, someone sealed goods for transport, someone traded across the river, paid tax, received rations, made offerings, fed children. When pottery scatters across a surface where no settlement is visible, it tells researchers that the land has forgotten something people once knew intimately. But pottery alone cannot reveal why the kingdom disappeared. For that, the mud itself must be red. Sediment cores are taken from flood basins, abandoned channels, former canals, and low ground near ancient settlements. A core looks unimpressive at first, a cylinder of earth extracted from below the surface. Yet inside it lies a vertical history of water and land. Fine silts may indicate slow seasonal flooding. Coarse sands may suggest stronger flow. Organic dark layers may point to marshes or standing water. Charcoal flecks may hint at burning nearby. Pollen grains reveal what plants grew in the region. Tiny shells and microscopic organisms show whether water was fresh, stagnant, fast-moving, or brackish. The kingdom's story becomes visible not as a chronicle, but as texture. What survives in these layers suggests that the river transformed the environment around the settlements in ways that people could not easily reverse. Some areas show signs of sudden high-energy flooding. Others show a gradual shift from cultivated land to wetland. Elsewhere, older channels appear to have been abandoned, leaving once important sites stranded away from navigable water. The evidence remains incomplete, and the interpretation varies from place to place. But the broad pattern is unmistakable. The landscape was not merely occupied and then deserted. It was physically rewritten. This is where archaeology becomes almost detective work, though the crime scene is thousands of years old and the main suspect has continued moving ever since. A buried wall may reveal that a building stood where modern maps show only farmland. A layer of river sand inside that building may reveal flood intrusion. A later repair above the sand may show that people returned. Another flood layer may show that the return failed. A final deposit of wind-blown dust, reed growth, or sterile mud may mark abandonment. None of these layers says, by itself, the kingdom collapsed here. Together, they suggest a place repeatedly struck, repaired, and finally released. One lesser-known but powerful clue comes from canals that lead nowhere. On the ground, an ancient canal may appear as a shallow depression, a line of greener vegetation, or a long, low ridge where excavated soil was once piled along the banks. From the air, it may appear more clearly, especially when crops grow differently above buried features. Some canals stop abruptly because later erosion removed them. Others fade into old channels that no longer carry water. A canal leading to a dead river course can reveal the exact dependence of a settlement on a vanished hydrological world. It is infrastructure attached to an absence. Remote sensing has changed this kind of research profoundly. Satellite images can show ancient riverbeds invisible at human height. During certain seasons, buried channels hold moisture differently from surrounding soil, creating faint bands across the landscape. Thermal imagery, radar, and elevation models can reveal subtle levees, abandoned meanders, and settlement mounds hidden beneath vegetation or farmland. What once looked like isolated ruins can suddenly appear as parts of a connected river system. The kingdom re-emerges not as a list of sites, but as a water-shaped network. Still, technology does not remove uncertainty. It often reveals how much remains unresolved. A pale line on a satellite image may be an ancient channel, a modern drainage feature, a road, or a geological formation. A mound may contain a settlement, a cemetery, a natural levee, or several phases of use layered together. Excavation is needed, and excavation is slow. Even then, the river may have mixed periods together, eroded crucial evidence, or deposited material from upstream in places where it confuses local history. Scholars still debate the chronology of many riverine collapses because mud is not a clock unless it can be dated. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal, seeds, wood, or shell can help. But samples may be older than the deposit if they were reworked by floodwater. Pottery styles provide relative dating, but styles can persist unevenly across regions. Inscriptions are precious, yet they usually survive in small numbers and often reflect elite concerns rather than environmental reality. The result is a reconstruction built from overlapping probabilities rather than a single clear line. The human remains, when found, complicate the story further. Some burials may show continuity, with communities remaining in place through difficult periods. Others may indicate disruption, cemeteries abandoned, burial customs altered, bodies interred in less formal ways. Isotopic studies can sometimes reveal changes in diet or movement, showing whether people grew up locally or migrated from elsewhere. Teeth and bones can preserve signatures of childhood stress, malnutrition, disease, or changing food sources. These clues do not speak loudly, but they bring the kingdom back from abstraction. Collapse is not only a pattern in sediment, it is lived inside bodies. Administrative objects add another layer. Sealings, weights, tokens, tablets, inscribed jars, or marked containers can show where goods moved and where officials operated. If such objects disappear from a site while ordinary pottery continues, it may suggest that state administration withdrew before the population fully left. If they appear in new locations, power may have shifted rather than vanished. The river may have swallowed the old kingdom while helping create new centers of authority elsewhere. Disappearance in one place can be transformation in another. No single explanation fully accounts for every fragment because the fragments themselves belong to different scales. A sand layer records a flood. A deserted canal records hydrological change. A shrinking settlement records demographic stress. A missing tax archive records administrative failure. A change in burial pattern records social adjustment. Each clue is true, but none is complete. The kingdom is reconstructed through the tension between them. And then there are the finds that feel almost too ordinary. A grinding stone left in a house, a child's bead in a flood deposit, a broken sickle blade near a storage room. animal bones from a meal eaten before abandonment, finger marks preserved in a sun-dried brick. These things do not explain the collapse, but they prevent it from becoming too clean. They remind us that the kingdom was not swallowed as a concept. It was swallowed household by household, field by field, memory by memory. The mud preserves disaster without drama. It does not tell us who wept when a wall fell, who refused to leave, who loaded a boat in silence, who returned after the water dropped and decided not to rebuild. It leaves instead a flaw, a jar, a deposit, a gap. The rest must be inferred carefully, without pretending certainty where none exists. Yet the fragments are enough to make one thing clear. The river did not simply pass over a kingdom and vanish from the story. It became the story's author. It edited the landscape, erased lines, buried evidence, moved clues out of order, and left behind a record written in silt. Every excavation is an attempt to read that writing before the river changes the page again. The deeper researchers look beneath the silt, the less the fall resembles a single disaster. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the mystery. A river may be the most visible agent of destruction, but civilizations rarely collapse for one reason alone. They weaken through entanglement, water changes, crops fail, officials demand more, local loyalties loosen, trade routes shift, rulers lose legitimacy, and then later generations look back and search for one clean cause. History almost never gives them one. The river remains the central force because it touched everything. It fed the fields, moved goods, shaped sacred geography, and held the kingdom's settlements together. When it changed course, intensified flooding, abandoned canals, or buried farmland beneath sediment, the shock would have been profound. Yet the river did not act in isolation. It struck a society with its own tensions, and those tensions shaped the outcome. This is where the debate begins. One explanation emphasizes climate. Changes in rainfall across the river's upper basin may have altered flood cycles, making them more erratic, more extreme, or too weak to sustain established agriculture. A sequence of unusually wet years could have increased flooding and encouraged channel breaches. A prolonged dry phase could have lowered flows, stranded canals, reduced harvests, and forced communities into conflict over water. Some reconstructions from lake sediments, cave formations, pollen records, and regional climate proxies show that ancient societies often faced abrupt shifts in moisture patterns. But connecting broad climate change to one kingdom's collapse is difficult. Climate creates pressure. It does not automatically dictate political failure. Another explanation focuses on river mechanics. Even without dramatic climate change, a sediment-heavy river on a low floodplain can gradually raise its bed, migrate laterally, and eventually abandon one course for another. In this view, the kingdom was built during a favourable window in the river's long wandering life. Its rise depended on a channel position that later became unstable. The disaster was not an interruption of the normal history, but the return of older floodplain behaviour. This explanation fits the physical evidence of abandoned channels, avulsion deposits, and settlement shifts. Still, it does not explain why adaptation failed in some places while succeeding in others. A third explanation points toward political weakness. Perhaps the court had already overextended itself before the river crisis sharpened. Irrigation networks require trust, labour, and coordination. If elites competed for resources, if tax burdens became too heavy, if local officials exploited emergency powers, or if the royal centre lost credibility, then environmental stress would have hit a brittle system. In this version, The river exposed failure more than it caused it. The danger in this interpretation is going too far and treating the environment as background. The mud layers, channel scars, and abandoned waterworks make clear that the physical transformation was real. Scholars still debate the balance among these explanations because each type of evidence speaks a different language. Sediment speaks of water energy and deposition. Settlement patterns speak of human movement. Inscriptions speak of what rulers wanted remembered. Botanical remains speak of farming, diet, and ecology. None of them alone can carry the whole story. The collapse sits at their intersection. There are also theories involving tectonics. Even small shifts in elevation can matter on a flat floodplain. An earthquake does not need to topple every building to alter drainage. A subtle rise or subsidence in the land can change the gradient of channels, redirect water, or worsen flooding in low basins. In regions where tectonic activity is possible, researchers examine fault lines, displaced sediments, and abrupt changes in drainage patterns. The evidence for such influence may be suggestive rather than conclusive. It is easy to invoke earthquakes when a river behaves strangely. It is harder to prove that one caused a kingdom's decline. Then there is the possibility of human engineering backfiring. Canals can stabilize agriculture, but they can also offer new paths for floodwater if poorly maintained or overwhelmed. Embankments protect land, but they may increase water pressure and raise riverbeds by trapping sediment within channels. Cutting off smaller floods can reduce natural silt renewal in some fields, while worsening catastrophic risk elsewhere. Ancient engineers understood many practical realities of water, but every intervention changes a river's behavior. A kingdom that becomes skilled at control may also create new forms of vulnerability. This is one of the more surprising lessons of floodplain archaeology. Human success can store up future danger. The better a society becomes at holding water in place, the more settlement expands into places that feel newly safe. The more land brought under cultivation, the more people depend on continued control. The more impressive the hydraulic system, the more catastrophic its failure can become. No single embankment has to be foolish for the overall system to become fragile. A disputed popular theory sometimes appears around disasters like this that a single enormous flood, almost mythic in scale, instantly drowned the kingdom and inspired later legends of a lost realm beneath the water. Such stories are attractive because they are simple and cinematic. They may preserve distant memories of real floods, but taken literally they are usually unsupported. The archaeological evidence more often points to a combination of severe events, long-term landscape change, and human vulnerability rather than one clean apocalyptic moment. A great flood may have occurred. It may even have been remembered for generations, but the kingdom's disappearance was almost certainly more complex than a wave in a legend. War cannot be dismissed either. Environmental decline often invites conflict. A weakened kingdom attracts rivals. Displaced populations put pressure on neighbouring lands. Local elites may rebel when central authority falters. Fortifications may be repaired not only against water but against people. Weapons, destruction layers, trauma on skeletal remains, and abrupt changes in material culture can all indicate violence. Yet war may be consequence as much as cause. A rival army arriving after the river has already broken the state is not the same as a rival army causing the collapse. Later traditions may remember the conqueror and forget the floodplain that made conquest possible. The evidence remains incomplete because collapse destroys its own documentation. Archives may be flooded, burned, looted, or abandoned. Officials stop writing when the system that supports scribes fails. Oral memory reshapes events into moral lessons. Later rulers may claim credit for conquering lands already weakened by environmental disaster. Modern researchers must sort through silence, exaggeration, erosion, and survival bias. The absence of a record is not the record of absence, but it can feel that way when trying to reconstruct a vanished kingdom. What makes the river explanation powerful is not that it excludes other causes, it is that it connects them. A changed river can explain why fields failed. Field failure can explain famine. Famine can explain migration. Migration can explain settlement shifts. Settlement shifts can explain administrative decline. Administrative decline can explain weaker maintenance. Weaker maintenance can worsen river damage. River damage can undermine royal ideology. Ideological failure can encourage rebellion or fragmentation. Fragmentation can invite conquest. The river is not a single cause at the end of a chain. It is the force running through the chain. Still, caution matters. It is tempting to turn the river into a villain because the image is strong water swallowing walls, mud covering streets, a kingdom vanishing into the floodplain. But rivers are not villains. They are systems. They behave according to physical laws, not intentions. The tragedy belongs to the mismatch between human permanence and river time. A kingdom measures stability in rains, dynasties, harvests, and ancestral memory. A river measures it in gradients, sediment loads, flood cycles, and paths of least resistance. No ruler can negotiate with that directly. The debate beneath the silt therefore leads to a humbler answer. The kingdom was not destroyed only by climate, only by avulsion, only by political weakness, only by bad engineering, only by war and not by legend. It was undone by convergence. The river changed in ways that damaged the material base of power. The political system struggled to respond. Existing vulnerabilities deepened. Communities adapted unevenly. Some left, some stayed, some resisted, some benefited for a time. The kingdom did not vanish because history turned one key. It vanished because many locks failed together. And yet, when all the arguments are weighed, the river still remains at the centre, not as a simple murderer, but as the moving force that revealed how fragile the kingdom had always been. The people who survived the river did not experience the end of the kingdom as a clean historical boundary. They experienced it as decisions. Stay through another flood season, or leave before the next one. Repair the house, or strip it for beams. Plant the field, or save the seed. Follow relatives to higher ground, or trust the old canal one more year. Send a son with traders toward a safer town, or keep the household together. Sell animals before they starve, or keep them as the last measure of wealth. None of these choices looked like the fall of a kingdom while they were being made. They looked like survival. Migration begins unevenly. The poorest may be trapped longest because movement requires resources, animals, carts, boats, kin elsewhere, portable goods, permission, courage. The wealthy may leave early, carrying records, valuables, skilled workers, and ritual objects to safer estates or emerging towns near more reliable water. Craftspeople follow demand. Priests follow temples that still receive offerings. Traders follow navigable channels. Farmers follow soil if they can. Though farmers are often the least free to move from the land that defines their lives. What survives in the record suggests not one exodus, but many departures layered over time. A village thins. A district loses administrative objects but keeps domestic pottery. A cemetery stops receiving burials. A new settlement grows near a younger channel. Another town, far from the worst flooding, suddenly shows signs of population increase. These patterns are difficult to read with certainty, but they imply motion. the kingdom's people do not disappear with the old capital. They redistribute themselves across a changed world. For refugees, the river's destruction would have followed them in practical ways. Seed varieties suited to one flood regime might fail elsewhere. Irrigation skills learned in one district might not fit another. Land rights could be contested by earlier inhabitants. Newcomers might be welcomed as labourers in a depopulated region or resented as mouths to feed. Families arriving with nothing but tools and memory would have to negotiate status from below. Even survival could mean social dissent. Scholars still debate how visible these migrants are archaeologically. People do not always carry distinctive material culture when they move, especially within the same broader region. A pot style may spread through trade rather than migration. A new burial custom may reflect belief, intermarriage, or political influence. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet demographic movement is almost unavoidable when a river destroys fields, isolates towns, and breaks the old economic web. Even those who stay are changed by the departure of others. The river also moves skills. Canal diggers, boat builders, surveyors, grain measurers, potters, reed workers, and scribes do not vanish simply because the state weakens. They carry knowledge into new places. A collapsed kingdom can become a hidden engine of later societies, transferring techniques without preserving its name. A community downstream may adopt improved irrigation methods from displaced workers. A new market may grow because merchants reroute around abandoned ports. A smaller polity may inherit administrators trained in the old court. Collapse scatters expertise like seeds after a flood. One lesser-known consequence of such disasters is the survival of women's labour informs the official record rarely honours. When households move, it is often women who preserve seed stores, textile skills, food preparation methods, kinship ties, ritual practices, and the small portable continuities that make a new settlement livable. A state may lose its archives, but a family can carry recipes, weaving patterns, mourning customs, lullabies, healing knowledge, and stories of where the water reached. These traces rarely appear as royal history, yet they may outlast royal names. Children born during the migration inherit a divided memory. Their parents remember the old river as centre. The children know it as warning. To them, the lost city may be a place of fragments, a mound visited for offerings, a dangerous marsh where elders say streets once ran, a source of bricks taken from ruins, a name used in stories when explaining why the family no longer lives where the ancestors lived. Within one generation, homeland becomes origin story. No single explanation fully accounts for how communities decide whether to remain or move. Attachment to place is powerful, so is hunger. Sacred obligation can keep people near ruined temples. Debt can bind them to landlords. Fear can drive them away before conditions become impossible. Opportunity can pull them toward new channels even if the old land has not fully failed. Migration is not only forced, it is strategic, reluctant, hopeful, and unequal. Some survivors probably adapted in place. They shifted crops, raised floors, moved houses to higher mounds, relied more on fishing, herding, reeds, or trade, and accepted a smaller scale of life. A former city could become a cluster of villages among ruins. A royal warehouse could be reused as shelter. Bricks from official buildings could be stripped for domestic walls. Sacred spaces might persist long after political authority dissolved. Because gods and ancestors do not always leave when officials do. Others moved into the new wetlands created by the river's change. What was disaster for farmers could be opportunity for fishers, bird hunters, reed cutters, boatmen, and pastoralists using seasonal margins. The post-collapse landscape was not empty. It was different. Marshes can support life richly, but not the same life as an irrigated kingdom. They favour mobility, local knowledge, and smaller communities over centralised grain extraction. The river may have reduced royal power while opening space for people better suited to its new form. This is an important correction to the image of disappearance. The kingdom vanished as a kingdom, but its people continued as human beings inside altered possibilities. Some lost status, some died, some were displaced, some adapted. Some may even have prospered along new routes. Collapse is rarely universal darkness. It is uneven redistribution of suffering and opportunity, with grief concentrated in the places that later archaeology marks as abandoned. The refugees carried stories, and stories changed with distance. A farmer explaining his family's move might speak of a canal that failed, a flood that ruined seed, an official who demanded grain anyway, a temple festival no longer held, a disease season after stagnant water came. His grandchildren might simplify it. The river took the city. The gods withdrew. The king failed. The land drowned. The exact sequence becomes less important than the moral shape. Human memory compresses complexity into images that can be passed on. In those images, the river grows larger. It becomes not merely a watercourse, but a boundary between before and after. Before, there were full granaries, loud markets, straight canals, royal processions, and fields green with promise. After, there were reeds in the streets, boats tied to broken walls, unfamiliar villages, hunger, and the long work of beginning again. Of course, the real before was never perfect, and the real after was not only ruin, but memory does not preserve balance. It preserves meaning. The court may have tried to resettle people deliberately. States under stress often move populations to restore agriculture, secure frontiers, or rebuild labour pools. Some communities may have been ordered to new districts, not simply driven by choice. Such movements can create resentment that lasts generations. A village forced from ancestral land may obey outwardly, while preserving a private sense of loss. Archaeology rarely captures that bitterness directly. But settlement patterns may show planned relocation, regular layouts, new canals, sudden occupation of previously marginal zones. Trade networks also bent around the disruption. Merchants are among the first to adapt because their survival depends on movement. If one port silts up, they test another. If a channel becomes dangerous, they use overland segments. If royal toll stations fail, local powers emerge to tax routes. The disappearance of a central kingdom can fragment commerce, but it can also diversify it. Smaller nodes replace one great hub. Goods continue moving, though through a changed political landscape. The river's survivors therefore became agents of transformation, not merely victims. They carried labour, memory, skills, resentment, and adaptation outward. Neighbouring regions absorbed them. New settlements grew from them. Later polities may have inherited their techniques while erasing their disaster. This swallowed kingdom lived on in people who no longer called themselves by its name. And perhaps that is the quietest form of disappearance. Not the moment when the water covers a wall, but the moment when descendants no longer know exactly which wall it was. Only that once, somewhere back along the family line, the river came too close and the old world had to be left behind. Memory does not preserve a ruined kingdom the way mud does. Mud keeps fragments without caring what they mean. It seals a floor, buries a jar, stains a wall, holds pollen in darkness, and waits. Memory works differently. It selects, reshapes, softens, sharpens, and sometimes invents a cleaner pattern than life ever had. A disaster that took decades to unfold may become one terrible flood. A complicated political decline may become the failure of a king. A shifting channel may become punishment, miracle, warning, or curse. By the time the story reaches later generations, the kingdom that lived in records and fields may have become a place half historical and half moral. The first memories likely belonged to those who left. They carried the names of districts that no longer produced grain, temples that stood beside dead channels, villages abandoned after the banks collapsed, cemeteries swallowed by marsh, and roads that ended in water. At first, these names were practical. People needed to say where they had come from, which land had belonged to whom, where ancestors were buried, which families had once held status, which obligations had been lost or transferred. But as years passed, geography became less precise. Children born elsewhere knew the old places through fragments, a bend in the river, a tower visible from a boat, a granary where reeds grew through the roof, a mound where bricks could still be dug from the earth. Then the fragments became story. What survives in later tradition often suggests a drowned or swallowed realm, even when archaeology points to a more gradual transformation. This is not necessarily false. It is memory working at human scale. A person does not remember sedimentation rates, long-term avulsion processes, or administrative contraction. A person remembers the year the family left, the flood mark on a wall, the field that could not be planted, the body not recovered, the temple bell that no longer sounded across dry land. When these memories gather, they condense into the image of a kingdom taken by water. Scholars still debate how much historical truth can be recovered from such traditions. Some legends may preserve real environmental events, distorted but not meaningless. Others may attach older stories to visible ruins long after their original context is lost. A mound near a marsh invites explanation. A carved stone in a riverbed demands a tale. A line of bricks exposed after a flood becomes proof that a city lies underneath, whether or not the details are remembered correctly. The evidence remains incomplete, and oral tradition must be handled carefully, neither dismissed too quickly nor treated as literal history. One lesser-known feature of disaster memory is how often it clings to sound. People may forget exact dates and dynasties, but remember that bells are heard underwater, that voices rise from marshes at night, that drums sound beneath the reeds, that drowned streets become restless in certain seasons. Such motifs appear in many cultures around lost settlements. They should not be read as evidence in a narrow archaeological sense, but they reveal something psychologically true. A drowned place is imagined not as silent, but as continuing just below perception. The past is not gone, it is muffled. Place names can preserve older realities with equal subtlety. A village name meaning Old Ford may survive long after the ford disappears. A field name may refer to a palace, market, shrine, or canal no one can locate. A marsh may carry the name of a city that official history forgot. In some landscapes, names become fossils of human geography. They do not tell the whole story, but they hint at vanished arrangements of water, settlement, and memory. Later rulers may also reshape the lost kingdom for their own purposes. A dynasty claiming legitimacy might present itself as restorer of lands ruined by flood or misrule. A conqueror might exaggerate the weakness of the old kingdom, turning environmental decline into evidence of political unworthiness. Priestly traditions might interpret the disaster as the result of neglected rituals or moral failure. Local communities might tell a different story, one in which arrogant rulers ignored warnings from the river or forced people to maintain doomed walls. None of these versions is neutral. Each uses the past to explain the present. No single explanation fully accounts for why some vanished places become legends, while others disappear almost completely. Visibility matters. Ruins that remain above ground invite storytelling. Catastrophes that produce striking landscapes are easier to remember. Communities with strong oral traditions preserve more. Political usefulness helps some memories survive while others fade. But there is also an emotional factor. A kingdom swallowed by a river carries a powerful lesson that human power can be large, organized, sacred, and still temporary. The story becomes useful because it warns without needing exact proof. Parents can tell children not to trust the river's calm surface. Priests can remind worshippers that order must be maintained. Farmers can explain why certain low fields are avoided. Boatmen can point to a stretch of water and say that walls lie below. Even if the details shift, the warning remains attached to the land. Memory becomes a form of risk management, wrapped in myth. Over centuries, the real kingdom grows harder to see. Its kings become fewer in memory than they were in life. Its administrative complexity shrinks into a single palace or sacred city. Its long decline becomes a sudden fall. The farmers, labourers, potters, boatmen, women preserving household continuity, migrants negotiating new lives, and officials struggling with impossible repairs disappear behind the larger image of a drowned realm. Legend loves silhouettes more than systems. Yet the legend may preserve something that technical reconstruction can miss: the emotional truth of rupture. A sediment core can show a flood deposit. It cannot show what it meant for a community to stop believing that the next season would restore balance. A satellite image can reveal an abandoned channel. It cannot tell us how strange it felt when boats no longer arrived at a familiar landing. A pottery scatter can mark a deserted settlement. It cannot preserve the shame of leaving ancestral graves behind. Myth carries those human weights, even when it distorts the sequence of events. The swallowed kingdom may also have entered sacred geography. A river that destroys a capital is not easily regarded as ordinary afterward. Its bends, islands, marshes, and old channels may become charged with danger or holiness. Ritual restrictions may gather around certain places. Offerings may be made where the river broke through. Pilgrims may visit mounds believed to contain drowned temples. Fishermen may avoid deep pools associated with the dead. The catastrophe changes not only settlement, but the imagined personality of the landscape. What began as hydrology becomes cosmology. In later stories, the river may be described as if it chose, judged, remembered, or hungered. This is not scientific language, but it is understandable language. People living close to forces larger than themselves often speak of them in personal terms. A river that feeds and destroys is difficult to reduce to mechanics in ordinary speech. Calling it angry or sacred may be less an error than an acknowledgement of dependence. Modern researchers have to move carefully through this terrain. To dismiss legend entirely is to lose clues embedded in local memory. To accept legend literally is to risk replacing evidence with desire. The best approach is patient comparison. Where do stories cluster around actual buried channels, flood deposits, abandoned settlements, or old names? Where do they contradict the physical record? Where do they preserve a motif common to many unrelated disasters? The goal is not to prove every tale true, but to understand why this landscape kept telling stories about disappearance. And perhaps the most haunting legacy is that the kingdom's disappearance became more durable than its achievements. Its canals failed, its ports shifted, its archives broke apart, its royal claims faded. But the idea of a realm taken by water survived because it matched something people could see whenever the river rose. Even long after the political kingdom was gone, the river still moved through the plain, still carried mud, still exposed old bricks after floods, still reminded everyone nearby that land is not always as solid as it looks. Memory, like water, follows channels already carved for it. The river carved the first channel through the kingdom's fields and cities. Survivors carved the second through speech, warning, ritual, and story. By the time the two joined, history and legend had become difficult to separate. Beneath the mud lay one record. Above it flowed another. Between them stood the vanished kingdom, not entirely lost, but never again whole. After the kingdom, the river kept working. It did not pause over the ruins. It did not acknowledge that fields had gone silent, that granaries had emptied, that officials no longer arrived with seals and lists, that families had carried their lives elsewhere. It continued to shift, deposit, cut, flood, and withdraw. The river that had helped build the kingdom now treated its remains as part of the floodplain. A wall became an obstruction, a street became a channel, a courtyard became a basin for silt, a temple platform became high ground for reeds, birds, and later travellers who did not know what lay beneath their feet. The abandoned landscape changed quickly in some places and slowly in others. Where water lingered, streets filled with mud and vegetation. Roots entered brickwork. Pools formed in low rooms. Fish and insects colonized spaces once swept clean by household labor. Where the river moved away, the opposite happened. Channels dried, wells failed, and wind carried dust through empty courtyards. One district drowned in excess, another withered in absence. The kingdom had depended on balance, and after its institutions weakened, imbalance became the new geography. What survives in the record suggests that many ruined places were never entirely empty. People return to ruins for practical reasons. They take bricks, stone, timber, metal fittings, pottery, and anything else that can be reused. A collapsed palace may become a quarry. A sacred platform may become a landmark. A former administrative building may shelter herders in bad weather. Later communities may settle on the same mound because it remains slightly higher and drier than surrounding land. The old city dies as a political centre, but parts of it continue living as material. This reuse can confuse archaeology. A wall from the kingdom's final century may contain bricks stripped from a much older public building. A later village may disturb earlier burials. A temple site may be rebuilt by people with no direct connection to its founders. Artifacts move from original contexts into secondary ones. The river scatters, and humans scavenge. Together, they make the past harder to read. Yet this messy afterlife is also revealing. It shows that collapse does not create a clean emptiness. A vanished kingdom leaves resources, dangers, memories, and opportunities. Its roads may still guide movement even after maintenance ends. Its canals may become property boundaries. Its mounds may serve as refuges during later floods. Its bricks may enter ordinary houses built by people who know only that the old ones made strong materials. The dead kingdom becomes part of the living landscape. The river's new channels also reshape trade. Routes that once converged on the old capital or major ports begin bending elsewhere. A new landing grows near a reliable current. A market shifts to higher ground. Boatmen learn which branches remain navigable and which have become traps of mud and reeds. Merchants who once depended on royal protection negotiate with local powers. Taxes become tolls. Toll stations become small forts. Small forts become the seeds of new polities. The river does not end political life. It redistributes it. Scholars still debate how quickly successor communities formed after the collapse. In some areas, settlement may have contracted sharply, leaving generations of reduced occupation. Elsewhere, new centres may have appeared almost immediately, especially where water remained useful. The evidence remains incomplete because later occupation can destroy earlier layers, and abandoned wetlands can hide settlement traces beneath deep sediment. But the broader pattern is familiar across ancient floodplains. When one channel loses importance, another may gain it, and human life reorganizes along the new line. The Old Kingdom's disappearance may therefore look more absolute from the perspective of its former capital than from the perspective of the wider region. A court loses its river, but farmers elsewhere find another. A royal archive ends, but village memory continues. A trade hub declines, but merchants continue moving goods through different routes. The political name vanishes before the people do. A lesser-known detail is that wetlands created after river shifts can become archives of extraordinary environmental information. Marsh sediments may preserve pollen, seeds, insects, fish bones, reeds, and chemical traces that dry sites lose. They can reveal how quickly cultivated fields reverted to wild vegetation, whether grazing continued, whether people harvested reeds, whether freshwater conditions persisted, and how long abandoned channels remained seasonally active. The kingdom's end is therefore recorded not only in ruins, but in the return of non-human life. Reeds are among the first witnesses of abandonment. They grow where water stands shallow and sunlight reaches the surface. They spread into canals no longer cleared by labourers. They root in drainage ditches. They turn former fields into rustling barriers. For farmers, reeds can signal loss. For fishers and mat makers, they can signal livelihood. For archaeologists, reed growth preserved in sediment may indicate a shift from managed agriculture to wetland ecology. One plant can mark the passing of an entire political order. Birds follow, fish follow. Wild animals move through spaces once crowded by human noise. The land does not become empty. It becomes less obedient. That may be the most precise description of the post-kingdom landscape. It is not dead. It is no longer organized primarily around royal command. Later, peoples living over the ruins may have felt both attraction and unease. Old mounds offer elevation, but they also carry stories. Broken walls provide building material, but they may be associated with the dead. Deep pools near former channels may be rich in fish and heavy with taboo. A family might build beside a ruined platform because it is practical, then tell children not to wander there at dusk because the place remembers. Practical reuse and sacred caution can coexist easily. No single explanation fully accounts for how a ruined landscape becomes ordinary again. Time helps. New generations are born who know the Old Kingdom only as names, mounds, and warnings. Economic need helps. People use what is available. Political change helps. New authorities reinterpret old places to fit their own legitimacy. Environmental change helps most of all. When the river lays down enough silt, even a disaster surface becomes ground for later life. But the river's afterlife can also preserve danger. Abandoned channels may reactivate during rare floods. Old canals may guide water unexpectedly into settlements that forgot their original purpose. Building on an ancient mound may offer safety from ordinary inundation, while the surrounding low ground becomes hazardous. Later communities inherit the Old Kingdom's altered landscape without always inheriting its knowledge. The past remains active in the shape of the ground. This is why modern maps can be misleading. A river shown as a single blue line is a simplification. The real river includes former courses, flood basins, buried levees, marsh scars, seasonal channels, and human modifications. The kingdom understood one version of that network. Later peoples understood another. Today's landscape may show yet another. None is final. The old capital, if it remained visible at all, may have passed through stages of identity. First, it was a wounded city, then a reduced settlement, then a ruin, then a source of materials, then a mound with stories, then a place for scholars to measure, photograph, excavate, and argue over. Each stage is real, but none contains the whole life of the site. The river made the city, unmade it, covered it, exposed it, and turned it into evidence. The kingdom's roads also faded differently. Some were washed away, some became footpaths, some persisted because they followed natural ridges that still made sense. A road can outlive the state that built it if it continues to solve a problem. A canal can become a boundary long after it stops carrying water. A ruined embankment can become a village path. Infrastructure dies slowly when it remains useful in fragments. And so the post-kingdom world was not silence after disaster. It was adaptation after authority. It was the sound of smaller boats on different channels, reeds in old ditches, animals grazing where tax grain once grew, children playing on mounds made of collapsed houses, later farmers finding old bricks in their fields, and stories thickening around places where the river exposed carved stone. The river swallowed the kingdom as political centre, but it did not swallow time. It left a landscape layered with aftermath, where every new generation lived partly on top of the old mistake and partly inside the river's continuing experiment. The kingdom had tried to make the floodplain permanent. The river answered by making permanence temporary, then turning the ruins into ground for other lives. Modern researchers do not find the swallowed kingdom by looking for a single lost city on a map. They find it by learning to see what the river has tried to hide. A slight curve in a field boundary, a darker band of soil after rain, a line of vegetation growing greener than the land around it, a mound that seems too regular to be natural, a scatter of pottery exposed by ploughing, a depression filled with reeds where no modern canal is supposed to run. The kingdom returns first as pattern, not monument. From the ground, much of the evidence appears ordinary: a farmer's field, a marsh edge, a low rise, a cut bank after seasonal erosion. But from above, the landscape changes. Satellite imagery reveals pale loops where ancient channels once curved through the plain. Elevation models show ridges too low for the eye but high enough to guide settlement. Radar can sometimes detect buried features beneath vegetation or dry sediment. Old aerial photographs, taken before modern development erases subtle traces, become unexpectedly valuable. The river's former paths begin to emerge like faded writing held at the right angle to the light. What survives in the records suggests that the kingdom was not simply one city destroyed by one flood, but a network of settlements tied to a river system that changed shape over time. That insight matters. It shifts the search away from treasure and toward relationships. Where were the canals? Which settlements depended on which channels? Which fields fell out of use first? Did people move toward a new branch of the river, or away from the floodplain entirely? Did administrative centres disappear before villages, or did rural decline weaken the cities first? The questions become spatial, environmental, and human at once. Archaeology on a floodplain requires patience because the ground has been edited repeatedly. Excavators may open a trench expecting architecture and find meters of sterile silt. Another trench only a short distance away may reveal floors, hearths, and storage jars. A wall may stop abruptly where erosion removed it centuries ago. Artifacts may appear out of sequence because floodwater reworked older deposits. Even dating a layer can be difficult when charcoal is washed in from elsewhere or pottery fragments have been redeposited from an eroded settlement upstream. The evidence remains incomplete not because researchers lack imagination, but because the river has scrambled the archive. Sediment science has become one of the most important tools for rebuilding the lost landscape. Cores taken from old channels, marshes, levees, and basins allow specialists to reconstruct when water flowed, when it slowed, when wetlands formed, and when cultivated land may have been abandoned. Grain size reveals energy. Fine particles speak of quiet deposition. Coarse sand speaks of stronger current. Organic layers suggest standing water or marsh growth. Chemical signatures can indicate salinity. Flooding frequency, or changes in source sediment, pollen and phytoliths, those microscopic traces of plants, help identify whether fields, reeds, woodland, or pasture dominated a given period. The kingdom's end becomes visible in these tiny remains. A decline in crop pollen may suggest reduced agriculture. An increase in wetland plants may show fields giving way to marsh. A sudden sand layer may mark a destructive flood or channel breach. Fish bones in a former urban area may indicate changing use of the site, perhaps after abandonment. Insect remains can reveal stagnant water conditions. None of these clues alone proves collapse, but together they create a landscape biography, showing how a royal floodplain became something less governable. Scholars still debate the exact sequence because different sites tell different parts of the story. One place may show rapid inundation, another may show long decline, a third may show adaptation and continued occupation. This unevenness is not a problem to be explained away. It is probably the truth. River disasters are patchy. They create zones of destruction, zones of opportunity, and zones of delayed consequence. A kingdom may collapse politically while human life persists locally. Modern research increasingly respects that complexity. One lesser-known source of evidence comes from old maps and colonial surveys. When available, surveyors often recorded abandoned channels, ruins, mounds, local place names, ferry points, and seasonal wetlands before modern irrigation, roads, dams, and urban growth transformed the landscape again. These records can preserve features that no longer exist visibly. A note made by someone measuring land for taxation or navigation may become, centuries later, a clue to an ancient river course. Local knowledge matters too. Farmers know where ploughs strike brick. Fishermen know where carved stones snag nets. Herders know which mounds stay dry during floods. Villagers know stories attached to pools, embankments, and reed beds. Not every story is historically reliable, but ignoring local observation would be foolish. Archaeology often begins with someone saying that the ground behaves strangely there. Modern science then tests the claim with mapping, excavation, dating, and comparison. Remote sensing can identify targets, but excavation gives them human texture. A satellite can show an ancient channel, but a trench can reveal whether people built beside it, abandoned it, repaired it, or died near it. A drone image can outline a mound, but excavation can uncover bread ovens, storage rooms, seals, children's burials, animal bones, tools, and flood deposits pressed against walls. The combination of large-scale mapping and intimate excavation allows researchers to move between river system and household life. No single explanation fully accounts for every discovery, and the strongest reconstructions remain cautious. A channel shift may be dated broadly, but not precisely enough to match a particular ruler. A settlement may decline around the same period as hydrological change, but correlation is not automatic proof. An inscription may describe royal restoration, but royal language often exaggerates success. Researchers have to keep asking whether evidence shows cause, consequence, adaptation, or coincidence. That caution can make the story less tidy, but it makes it more powerful. The Swallowed Kingdom is not a puzzle solved by one spectacular artifact. It is a world rebuilt from damaged signals, a line of canals, a missing harbour, a flood layer inside a building, a shift in plant remains, a gap in administrative records, a change in settlement density, a story about bells underwater, a mound where pottery rises after rain. Each clue is partial, but partial clues can still converge. Modern technology also reveals the scale of what earlier generations missed. What looked like isolated ruins may belong to a continuous settlement corridor. What looked like natural marsh may contain a buried urban edge. What looked like a minor canal may have been part of a major irrigation artery. The kingdom grows larger and stranger as researchers map it more carefully. Its disappearance becomes less like a vanishing act and more like a slow change in visibility. It was never entirely gone. It was hidden in forms people had forgotten how to read. There is a quiet irony in this. The same floodplain that destroyed records also preserved environmental detail. The same silt that buried buildings protected some surfaces from later disturbance. The same marsh that made excavation difficult preserved organic remains. The river erased, but not perfectly. It covered its tracks with material that, under careful study, becomes testimony. And yet, even with satellites, cores, radiocarbon dates, drones, chemical analysis, and careful excavation, the river keeps some of its secrets. Researchers may reconstruct where the channel flowed, but not who first realized it would not return. They may identify abandoned houses, but not the final conversation before a family left. They may find evidence of famine, but not the names of the hungry. Scientific methods can restore structure to the past. They cannot fully restore experience. This is why the mystery remains alive. Not because nothing is known, but because enough is known to reveal the outline of something immense, and enough is missing to leave silence at the centre. The kingdom was real. The river changed. Settlements suffered. People moved. Authority weakened. Memory transformed disaster into legend. These things can be said with confidence in broad form. But the exact rhythm of the collapse, the final decisions of communities, the balance between flood and politics, the last days of the old court, and the emotional life of the survivors remain partly beyond reach. Modern eyes can follow the river's scars across the land. They can measure the height of abandoned levees, date the mud inside rooms, trace canals from orbit, and compare ancient pollen with modern vegetation. They can show that the kingdom's fate was not fantasy. It was written into geology, agriculture, and power. But every answer opens another layer. The river that swallowed the kingdom also swallowed the simplest version of the story. And perhaps that is why the evidence feels so compelling. It does not give us a legend cleaned of uncertainty. It gives us something more human, a civilization caught between confidence and change, preserved only in fragments because the force that sustained it also became the force that took it apart. The river still hides the simplest part of the story. It can show where it moved, where it broke through, where it laid down sand, where reeds replaced fields, where canals failed, and where people tried to repair the damage. It can leave ruins under mud and old channels under crops. It can preserve enough evidence for researchers to say that the kingdom's fate was tied to a changing floodplain. But it cannot give back the full human sequence. It cannot tell exactly when confidence turned into fear, when repair became impossible, or when the old world finally felt lost. That uncertainty matters. A vanished kingdom is often easier to imagine than to understand. The mind wants a single, final image: walls collapsing into brown water, people fleeing across flooded fields, a king watching helplessly as the river takes his capital. Something like that may have happened in places. There may have been nights of terror, levees breaking in darkness, boats overloaded with families and grain, temples surrounded by water, and districts abandoned in haste. But the larger truth is probably slower and more difficult. The kingdom was swallowed not only by floodwater, but by repeated adjustment, exhausted labour, broken trust, and a landscape that stopped obeying old expectations. What survives in the record suggests a civilization undone by convergence. The river changed, the fields suffered, the cities weakened, the court lost authority. People moved. Memory reshaped the disaster. Later generations saw ruins, marshes, old channels, and mounds, and they told stories of a realm taken by water. Those stories were not perfect history, but they were not empty either. They carried the emotional shape of collapse. Scholars still debate the order of events, and no single explanation fully accounts for every clue. That is not a failure of the evidence, it is the nature of the event itself. The kingdom was not a machine that stopped when one part broke. It was a living network of land, water, labour, belief, food, trade, memory, and power. When the river shifted, every part of that network felt the strain differently. Some places drowned, some dried, some endured, some were forgotten so completely that only pottery and soil marks remain, and somewhere beneath the plain, the old kingdom still exists in pieces, waiting for the next trench, the next satellite image, the next season when the river exposes a wall and then covers it again. The river did not erase everything. It erased enough. The wind down begins where the kingdom ends, not in silence, but in a softer kind of time. The river continues through the landscape, carrying silt over bones, seeds over ruins, fish over streets, and sunlight across water that once measured the power of kings. The old people are gone. Their officials no longer count the harvest. Their boats no longer crowd the royal landings. Their temples, if they survive at all, survive as shapes beneath earth, as stones pulled from mud, as stories told beside channels that no longer follow their ancient beds. And still, the river moves. That is the final unease of this story. Civilizations often imagine themselves as fixed points in the world. They build walls, laws, archives, shrines, calendars, and royal names as if permanence can be assembled from enough effort. For a while, it can. A kingdom can last longer than any human life. It can seem older than memory, stronger than weather, blessed by the very forces that feed it. But landscapes have older clocks. A river remembers gravity more faithfully than kings. It answers rainfall, sediment, slope, obstruction, and time. It gives generously, and then one day it gives differently. The people beside it may call that betrayal, but the river has made no promise. It has only moved according to its nature. What remains is not only a warning, it is also a trace of resilience. The kingdom vanished, but people carried pieces of it onward: skills, stories, seeds, rituals, fears, and ways of reading water. They became part of later worlds. The lost realm did not survive as a throne, but it survived as memory scattered through other lives. Somewhere under quiet fields, there may still be a floor where someone once stored grain against the flood season. Somewhere under reeds, a canal still points toward a channel that is gone. Somewhere in the mud, a broken jar lies exactly where the water left it. The river flows above all of it, calm again, as if nothing happened.